Please welcome moderator Will Giese and the limits of the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative panel.
Aloha. Now I know where I'm at. Thank you. So for all of you who might not know who I am, my name is William Giese, or Will. I am the executive director of the Hawaii Solar Energy Association, and I am also the volunteer chair of the Sierra Club of Hawaii's Energy Subcommittee. Looking at this panel here, I may also be the least well-known person standing up here for now. We'll see how the day goes. But in all honesty, thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to moderate this panel. This is a really fascinating conference to be a part of, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. When Doug and Frank asked me to moderate, I thought to myself, man, I wonder what this panel is going to be all about. You know, it occurs to me that I am a younger guy. Maybe it'll be a really good opportunity to moderate a discussion with some younger folks, getting their feet wet in the energy space like I am, just starting out. We'll have some good discussion. The topic won't be super heavy. We'll get a chance to reassure folks and tell them that, no, don't worry, we won't mess things up when we get our hands on it. But that is not quite what happened. Today's panel is titled The Limits of the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, which you've already heard a little bit about. Like was mentioned, this year marks the 10-year anniversary of the HCEI agreement. And with me today, I have some folks my age might call the OGs of the HCEI agreement. So, without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists, get into the discussion. At the top, I'm going to give them a few minutes to introduce themselves and their position on this topic, and then we'll dive right into questions. I'd also encourage you to read our panelists' bios within the program website, a little bit more of an extensive bio. So to my left, starting us off, we have the former chair of the Hawaii PUC from 2011 to 2015, Ms. Mina Morita. Next, we have Mr. Jerry Sumida, a partner at Carlsmith. Let's get into the discussion. At the top, I'm going to give them a few minutes to introduce themselves and their position on this topic, and then we'll dive right into questions. I'd also encourage you to read our panelists' bios within the program website, a little bit more of an extensive bio. So to my left, starting us off, we have the former chair of the Hawaii PUC from 2011 to 2015, Ms. Mina Morita. Next, we have Mr. Jerry Sumida, a partner at Carlsmith Ball and a member of the HCEI Steering Committee. And last but not least, we have Mr. Alan Oshima, President and CEO of the Hawaiian Electric Company. So I'd like to invite Ms. Morita to start us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. And it's not OG, it may be kupuna. I asked to use the podium because I actually took 45 years of energy history, condensed it to 3.5 pages, double-spaced with a 14 font. And so so that's the Cliff Note version. But if you want the larger version, I'm shamelessly going to promote this book that Sam Pins and I wrote together called The Clean Energy from Earth, Wind, and Sun, Learning from Hawaii's Search for a Renewable Energy Strategy. So there are 3 points that I want to touch on today. First is the energy policy history and the timing and convergence of events leading up to HCEI. Second is the alignment of leadership and resources to facilitate HCEI. And the third is the challenge of staying on track to effectuate and facilitate a total system transformation. So attention to energy policy development and coordination began long before the formation of HCEI. The 1973 oil embargo and the energy crisis that followed gave impetus to the Hawaii State Legislature to act. Acknowledging Hawaii's vulnerability and dependence on imported fossil fuels, the legislature adopted a number of policy-linked initiatives beginning in 1974. And these initiatives included both an expansion of state agencies' responsibilities and the creation of new organizations at the University of Hawaii to stimulate research and development. So to quickly sum up the energy history after 1974 and before HCEI, oil was relatively cheap most of the time. Renewable energy technology was in a nascent stage and expensive. Political will was usually short-lived, typically lasting during the duration of an oil price spike, and climate change was not a major concern. And furthermore, HECO was a political force to contend with, and the HECO companies operated in a steady state, usually swatting off pesky intrusions into its businesses, whether it was the Energy Office, a legislator, or anyone else bold enough to question its operations. Then in the late 1990s, frustrated by the HECO company's inability to provide reasonable alternatives, the utilities faced considerable opposition from the public, and by extension, politicians reacting to support their constituents, fighting transmission projects like the Wa'ahila Ridge and Kamokupukele on Oahu, and generation projects like the Keauhole expansion on Hawaii Island and the proposed Waiena generation facility on Maui. These contentions, I believe, helped to open the door to look at electricity issues differently and question the HECO company's integrated resource plans. This helped to shift some of the political power dynamics. And then this became more acute when Linda Lingle, a Republican, was elected governor. When all of Linda Lingle's non-energy proposals failed to gain traction or were killed in a Democratic-controlled legislature, energy policy was the only issue that remained in the final years of her second term, where she could get both federal administration and congressional support and state legislative support. So prior to HCEI, and from my own legislative experience, there are many federal and state players who work diligently on energy policy, but many times lacking prioritization, coordination, and a cohesive strategy amongst key parties, progress was slow. Therefore, I believe that the most important role that HCEI played, and when it was most effective, was when there was a convergence and an alignment of key players who held crucial leadership positions, such as Governor Lingle using her position as a bully pulpit, Assistant Secretary Andy Kasner, and Senior Technical Advisor Bill Parks at the U.S. Department of Energy, who brought their willingness to participate and valuable federal resources to HCEI. U.S. Senator Daniel Inouye using his seniority in Congress to help direct resources and agency attention to Hawaii. State Energy Office Administrator Maurice Kaya, who was instrumental in developing relationships and grooming this federal-state partnership for more than a decade prior to HCEI. Myself and other legislators who are willing to push for necessary policy changes and ensure state resources. You had PUC Chair Carlito Caliboso tackling early regulatory reforms, Rick Roshlow at the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute managing fiscal and technical resources and providing analytical support, and HECO's Robbie in attempting to change the utility mindset. And then you also had the Department of Defense participating as it adopted renewable energy as a national security strategy. Given the amount of time I had, this isn't a slight on others that participated. I'm just limited by the amount of time I have. So I think we can all agree in the early years of HCEI, we did move the needle towards a clean energy transformation by harvesting a lot of low-hanging fruit. However, as administrations changed out because of election cycles and issues have become more complex, HCEI has lost the crucial leadership alignment necessary to continue on this track. And unfortunately, and this is my personal opinion, absent this alignment and lacking a coherent strategy from the bully pulpit and confusion on the status of HCEI, Hawaii's energy messages have become plagued with political sound bites, and many times lacking or ignoring sound analysis. And therefore, I believe the biggest shortcoming of HCEI was and is its inability to reform organizational cultures within key institutions and within the agencies and even the utilities to acknowledge the urgency and cultivate the discipline, the mindset, and skill sets necessary to survive political changes and thrive in a rapidly changing energy ecosystem, which is now even more complex and has been expanded to include transportation systems and even communication infrastructure and services. So unfortunately, and I'm concerned, failing to act in a timely manner, lacking flexibility, adaptability, and becoming more ideological than pragmatic, issues like fairness, equality, accessibility, affordability have fallen to the wayside, causing Hawaii's journey towards a clean energy future to be a more costly proposition than it needs to be, especially for those who can least afford it. So I hope my personal observations is enough to now stimulate the discussion and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Sure. I want to give Jerry, if you want to get maybe a minute to talk about your position on this, and then Alan, and then we'll get into some questions.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Let me, though, first ask the help of all of you in the audience. And we're going to ask 3 questions. They're yes or no questions. If yes, raise your hand as soon as I ask the question, and then I'll go to the next question. How many of you know what PURPA is? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you know what Section 210 of PURPA is? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you know what the 1978 Planning or State Planning Act is? Raise your hand. Okay. Let me supplement a little bit what Mina has very ably summarized in terms of HCEI. She told you some of the mechanisms as to how HCEI got officially started. But let me step back a little bit and give you perhaps a broader perspective from my own standpoint. For me, and I think for many, HCEI represented a number of things. It represented a concept, a vision, and initially a game plan. The concept was that Hawaii, having suffered through some fairly major oil embargoes, knew very well that its dependence on imported fossil fuels, subjection to price volatility, and also subjection to market security or supply security were matters that we could no longer live by on the one side. And on the other side, we had tremendous amounts of indigenous renewable energy resources. Wind and solar were obvious, but also geothermal and perhaps biomass and wave and OTEC at that time. The vision is that Hawaii could, if it sought to reduce its dependency on imported fossil fuel and the other adverse consequences, and positively develop its own plentiful alternative renewable resources, the vision was that Hawaii could stand as a model not only for itself, but perhaps for elsewhere. And that's what gave the U.S. Department of Energy a very focused interest in a partnership with Hawaii. And the game plan was embodied in the 2008 Energy Agreement in October of 2008, which was signed by a number of different parties in the state, including the Hawaiian Electric Companies and the U.S. Department of Energy, and which set forth a number of very detailed and specific projects, many of which have been accomplished, some of which have fallen by the wayside, and some of which have been superseded, which covered almost every single conceivable subject that you can now imagine that we talk about, including DERs, DRs, CBREs, and all the other initials of PUC dockets and initiatives. That was the vision, the concept, and the game plan. But the overall context was a unique partnership between the U.S. Department of Energy and the state of Hawaii to pursue the concept, the vision, and the game plan. And the game plan, by the way, was not something that was fixed in granite or concrete and forever to be and never to be changed. Quite the contrary. It was a list of projects that, to take a phrase from Mina, were kind of seen as the low-hanging fruit and the obvious next steps. And they did include electricity, yes, but they also included transportation, and they also included energy efficiency. And from those agreements and from that initiative came one other thing. The firm of Booz Allen Hamilton was asked to undertake a study for this newly formed initiative called the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, and to come up with a series of scenarios as to how Hawaii could achieve, and if I recall correctly, at that time, 70% clean energy in all of those areas by 2030. Those scenarios were developed, very, very comprehensive scenarios with timelines and, to a certain extent, at least initial lookings at what budgetary implications might be. And from that, a particular scenario was chosen, I think it was scenario 8, to be the basis of the roadmap going forward. Again, the roadmap was not fixed forever. It was really a set of guidelines and guideposts leading toward a particular direction. And it had short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. Task forces were set up, which were a combination of the public sector, the private sector, the regulated industries, the regulated parties, the regulators themselves, as well as academia. And a tremendous amount of work was done in each of those areas, and again, under a very vigorous and dynamic and focused partnership between the state of Hawaii and the U.S. DOE. And DOE's commitment to HCEI was embodied in the fact that several persons, including Bill Parks particularly, whom Mina mentioned, relocated to Hawaii on a temporary duty assignment which lasted over a year. And when Bill was transferred back to DOE, he was succeeded by at least 2 or 3 other people who also relocated back here. Now, times have changed, things have changed, the energy eco-environment has changed, the players have changed in many respects, but yet if you go back and look at the roadmap and make appropriate minor tweaks, it still is a very, very interesting approach to accomplishing many of the things that we are still talking about today. Does it need to be updated? Yes. Should it be updated and expanded? Very definitely so, because of new developments. But the whole underlying basis of it was not so much that they were looking to achieve a certain kind of thing. That kind of thing was embodied more in the PUC inclinations of the Utility of the Future white paper, which is a very, very seminal document. But the roadmap was really meant to be a force in which, or a basis on which the public sector and the private sector and all other, as we now call them, stakeholders, could join and participate in a focused forward move to work with and identify some of those programs and ultimately accomplish some of those specific projects. That was the vision, the concept, the game plan, the evolution of HCEI. And I think Mina did point out that as part of the times changing, HCEI in its original form perhaps became a little bit diffuse, and certainly now, as far as I personally am concerned, needs to be redefined. But the underlying concept and approach to me are still very vibrant. And as a number of speakers have pointed out, in particular Representative Chris Lee, Hawaii is still looked upon as a model that other people can at least seek to if not emulate, at least learn lessons from. And so for that extent, the HCEI initiative was the beginning of Hawaii achieving that stature. One final comment. HCEI did not emerge like, who was it, like Venus from the head of Juno. There was a lot that went before it. Mina mentioned some of those things, but PURPA and Section 210, by the way, is the one that basically said utilities had to enter into contracts and buy power from qualifying facilities at negotiated rates, and if you couldn't negotiate a rate, then the rate would be the avoided cost, and that's where all of that comes from. PURPA in 1978 and subsequent formed the basis for the revolution that has brought all of us here today with the impulse for renewables. Many of the other acts that I mentioned, including the State Planning Act, provided much of the foundation for HCI to build upon and to expand. So Hawaii itself has a long evolutionary history in seeking to define and pursue its own energy future based in large part on its own resources. And I think my conclusion is HCI served that really catalyzing effect and catalyzing import at that time. But in changing times, we still need HCI, but in a more transformed nature. Thank you.
So, thank you, Jerry. Mr. Oshima, I'd like to give you a little bit of time, but being cognizant because I want to get to some questions.
My comments are relatively short, but it kind of fits with what I've heard. I'll just give you kind of my personal journey because I dropped in on this job a little over 3 years ago. In 2008, when HCI was in its formative stages, I was just entering as a board member for Hawaiian Electric Company, having left Hawaiian Telecom. It in itself was interesting because I was a former colleague, partner of Jerry Sumida at Carlsmith, and I was always, Carlsmith never had the Hawaiian Electric account, but we had a lot of the IPPs, the PPAs, and so that was, and Kauai Electric. So my coming into Hawaiian Electric was really unusual because I always represented the IPPs seeking to have contracts with the dominant utility, or I represented Kauai Citizens Utilities and actually was instrumental in converting Kauai Electric to a co-op. So I come with a different mindset, which I think the board was looking for in terms of inserting a new leader into the company. Having heard the HCEI journey, I can see where the board was headed and what my job has become, and that's the transformation of the utility and from really seeking hybrid solutions to get to a policy implementation for the state. One thing that I think when you mention PURPA that it bears noting in Hawaii is that while avoided cost was somewhat the ceiling for IPPs, when it came to Hawaii for biomass, i.e. the plantations, if you couldn't reach agreement, then the avoided cost was the floor. There was a policy judgment made by the state to support its dominant industry at that time, sugar, by paying at the pump or in the electric rates a higher amount to support the workforce that was employed by our dominant agricultural activity. People don't maybe realize that, but policy, overall policy and what the state's economy is about actually should be the driver in terms and should be a part of our discussion in terms of clean energy. HCEI went for the low-hanging fruit, went for the kilowatt-hour production of clean electrons, realizing that it was really only about 30% of the total use of imported fossil fuels. But it was a good jump start. I think it's starting to transition now where where the clean electrons are there. There's a commitment to it. I don't think what's there right now is that overall global perspective of how does the economy allow us to get to where we need to be, i.e., like it used to be. That discussion of the economy, of our workforce, what is the state's goals, it cannot be just micro-focused on how you produce a clean electron. That is not going to work. We live more than any other state in what I call a terrarium. We are self-supporting. We are not connected to any other state. So everything has to work in conjunction with what we do. So state policy is important. And I don't think that discussion, I think that's a common theme. We need to get back to all the stakeholders being around the table saying, what do we really want to accomplish? And it's not just a clean electron. That was a jump start. What do we really want to accomplish for our state in doing this?
Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. And I'll kind of go off of this on my first question to you all. I read through the HCEI, and a couple of things jumped out at me. One of those was, it calls out for things like the inter-island cable, or things like 400 megawatts of wind resource, or lots of electric vehicles, being a leader in the fleet. And you kind of talk about going back to the table together and figuring out what is moving forward. And the HCEI was this forward-looking document. But a lot of the stuff that was in it did not happen that specific way. And so kind of going back, what do you all think? Maybe I'll turn it over to you. What do you think if we were to go back to that board, what it would look like moving forward?
I think knowing what we know now, and it came up earlier in Doug's comments, that, when we just speak about renewable energy, we're thinking really linear. We're thinking of only one part of the equation, but when we speak to decarbonization, we're taking more of a systems approach. And I think this is our challenge right now, that we tend to fall back on easier solutions, the low-hanging fruit, looking for a panacea to fix our problems. But the system is more complex. And as I mentioned in my comments, we're redeveloping our electrical infrastructure. We're modernizing the grid. We need to modernize our transportation infrastructure, and that transportation infrastructure is multimodal. It's just not solely renewable energy. On top of that, our communications infrastructure plays a huge role in modernizing our economy. So what is the role of the state in ensuring we stay on track to make sure that we have modernized platforms that can be flexible and adaptable to these advancing technologies to move us forward? And it all comes down to planning. And so it's not so much, it's not anymore focusing on renewables, but in taking a more complex systems approach in addressing critical infrastructure.
It's interesting, our prep call, we realized that we're all kind of on the same page, coming from different perspectives. One of the and I don't want to take away from an afternoon panel that our Scott Sue is moderating on communities, but we've come to realize that we're a small company compared to other utilities across the nation, but in Hawaii, we are who we are just because there aren't a whole lot of large companies in Hawaii. So we feel a responsibility to use our platform for the good of Hawaii. I say that seriously. I think, and all the people here from Hawaiian Electric will vouch for me on this, we continually preach how do we use our expertise, our ability to enact change, working with our communities. To Mina's point, we got to get off just the clean electron, but what is the value to the community in moving Hawaii forward? So we're looking at our pole infrastructure, for example. And how does that provide for broader broadband penetration into underserved areas? How can we be a facilitator for that? Once you get that there, that helps economic development in those areas, but it also improves telemedicine, all kinds of things that the communities might not have now, but could have at a lower cost. It also allows us to be able to use smart inverters on rooftop systems that we presently can't use because there's no communications abilities in some of these areas. So it does fit in with the RPS and moving Hawaii to a cleaner energy future. But it's not just all about energy. It's got to be about mobility, equity. How do we get all of these things out to provide value to Hawaii's customers?
Okay, there's a lot there. You know, and you're talking about our prep. We had just as many really good questions about this too. One of the things that you had mentioned during prep, Mr. Oshima, was that...
Call me Alan.
Sorry.
Call me
Alan.
Alan.
Alan, was that, HECO, or the Hawaiian electric companies, have to remain technology agnostic in certain ways. But I'm wondering, we have this 2045 RPS, we have the HCEI that called out drew a box a certain way and excluded certain things. And now looking at it again, I mean, should the state be in a position where they may not be technology agnostic if we were to renegotiate an HCEI? What do you think about that?
This is where policy comes in, and there has to be multiple stakeholders. And Carol and Sean's in here, Leo Asuncion, Carol and myself, Lorena Kiba and others were sponsored by the British government to go and see Scotland and how they're doing on their offshore wind and all the issues involved with that. And so you bring that kind of knowledge back to Hawaii. Does it fit with what we are in Hawaii? As the utility, I have to be agnostic about it because it's a technology that we have to consider. But all the other stakeholders have to be a part of that. Is that what we want, right? And we have a strong military presence here. So it's not just aesthetics, it's not about just the technology, it's what do we want as a state? I'm not the convener of that discussion, nor can I be the roadblock for that discussion. We have to have those discussions, but sometimes they're not the right parties around the table. And that's what I think we're all kind of saying. We may need a convener, and it may be the state government, somebody else, but to bring all of the parties together so we can map out the kinds of things that we're looking at. Biofuels, biomass is another issue. On what island, but what does it serve in terms of our total energy needs, and how does it get transported, right? If you create a biofuel on Maui, but it has to be liquefied for transport to place of need on Oahu, that's added cost. And is that what we want to do? These are discussions that we're not holding right now, but believe me, there are people who come to the utility with proposals. We sign NDAs, and we can't be very public about what we're talking about for that reason, because there are economic interests involved. But I'm not sure that we're the proper party to actually facilitate that discussion all the way to the end.
Yeah, that leads to kind of an interesting segue, because, Will, you asked, should one go back, or you suggested, should one go back to the game plan of the HCEI, which really was the appendix to the energy agreement in October 2008 that the various parties signed. But as I mentioned before, that was a whole list of projects that provided a game plan. It didn't say all of those projects were achievable within a particular time frame, or as time and events and circumstances evolved, that those are the only projects that should be considered. Obviously, one does not drive forward by looking in the rearview mirror. So one can go back to those projects lists, as a matter of informing oneself as to what they were. But really what we're talking about is today, and even more so tomorrow. And one of the things that Alan just emphasized, but also Mina had mentioned, is really by implication, what is the process by which you do this? We don't have time to go into this now, so let me just mention one particular experiment that put Hawaii on the international attention list once again. In 1970, the state of Hawaii undertook, actually it culminated in 1970, but the state of Hawaii undertook a project called Hawaii 2000, which was to look at the futures of Hawaii, the alternative futures, and then try to select a preferred future. This was a statewide project over a year and a half. It involved thousands of people from every single stratum and island and so forth and so on that you want. You can look at it. There's a book called Hawaii 2000 that the University of Hawaii Press put out. Its chapters are mainly the task force work, the working group task forces covering a number of things. The economy section, which I reviewed just recently, has a number of pages about energy and what Hawaii can and should do about energy. This kind of program was led by the governor, the leaders in the legislature, top private sector people, the Chamber of Commerce, and the catalyst was the then editor, George Chaplin of the Honolulu Honolulu Advertiser, Pulitzer Prize winning editor. That was the kind of initiative that all of them agreed had to be looked at for the future of Hawaii at that point, and there was a millennium time, had to be, looking toward the millennium, had to be looked at in order to figure out as a state and a people where we should be going. We have had some of that in the early days of the HCEI. We have lost some of that in the current state of the HCEI. If we want to have a rejuvenated HCEI, the framework, the groundwork, even in many cases the outlines of the vision are there, which need to be tweaked, as I said. But we could do that starting now, but it does need leadership and it does need full participation of all the parties. The legislature can legislate anything it wants. It's the private sector that does things. The legislation can help, can hinder, or be neutral only if there's working together with, among others, the communities, the utility, and everybody else, including big purchases like DOE, can something effectively come out of that. But unless and until that's done, we will be fragmented, and we all know the results of fragmentation. The initiative that Chris Lee pointed out about the mayors and transportation, you know, that's something on the grassroots. That's something that didn't need legislative action. That's an initiative that are the kinds of things that if we mobilize together in a structured but not dictatorial way, the results could be amazing, as they always are when you get everybody involved moving forward in generally the same direction.
So I think the commonality at that effort with that Hawaii 2000, the result of that was the 1974 Planning Act and the functional plans.
Right.
And the commonality with HCEI is you had Governor Ariyoshi at that time pushing for this comprehensive planning statewide. And with HCEI, you had Governor Lingo using her bully pulpit in bringing the key players to push HCEI forward. And I think that's a critical element that's missing right now when the state faces these huge infrastructure investments that need to be made. We're sort of wondering, what's the position of the administration?
Jerry, you know, you were on the steering committee of HCEI, and you mentioned just recently that, you know, you have to, private industry as a driver in a way. And so that steering committee originally, you know, was consisted of a certain type of people from a certain amounts of industries, but excluded others. And I'm wondering now, if you were to go back and look at the steering committee, if you were to make a new HCEI for the next 10 years, who would it include now that it didn't before?
Yeah, actually, the steering committee was inclusive rather than exclusive. When it was originally set up, it really drew people from the government, from the utilities. There were several from the legislature, but also a whole bunch of people from the private sector. There were wind, solar, our good friend from the Big Island, Richard High, for the agricultural and geothermal side of things. There was the Department of Defense, and many others. So the steering committee was not exclusive, quite the contrary, it was inclusive. And one of the things that the steering committee was supposed to do was to help the various working groups, which were also very inclusive in about 7 or 8, as I recall, different subject matter areas, to help and support the work of the steering groups. And the work of the steering groups was to come up with analyses, further analyses from the Booz Allen scenario work, and specific kinds of initiatives that could be taken in these various areas, which included, believe it or not, air transportation, sea transportation, electric vehicles, as well as the whole panoply of energy-related projects. So it was a very, very broad-based effort, and the participation of the private sector was very extensive and very vibrant. So if one is to look at it again, that to me is a kind of model that one would need to have as a basic framework, and infuse in that a lot of the ideas and thoughts and sensitivities that Alan has mentioned, as well as Mina.
Okay. Kind of 3 minutes left here. I will kind of pose this question to the group. You talked about, Jerry, you and I talked individually about DOE involvement with the HCEI and how that has seemed to wane over time. And I'm wondering, how do we bring the DOE back? How can we involve more folks into this? And what does it look like moving forward, from today, 10 years on, 20 years on, 30 years on?
Well, maybe a couple of quick observations, and then I guess that Alan and Mina may have some very complementary additional perspectives. DOE, among other things, really brought NREL into the National Renewable Energy Lab system into close cooperation with a lot of the Hawaii initiatives. It also helped to, I think, work with and strengthen the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, HNAI, which has now become a really strong powerhouse in many, many different ways. It also made available on a number of different levels, different kinds of funding and other technical resources, meaning very good people from the DOE to bring in. Now, DOE, I guess, is still involved to a certain extent. Obviously, DOE as a department on the federal level is undergoing, various transformations or whatever. But as a partner, they were superb. And it seems to me that one could seek to, resurrect and enhance, perhaps in a slightly different way, that same kind of cooperative partnership.
I'll just speak from the utility standpoint. We still really interact a lot with the DOE. Colton Ching, our Senior VP of Technology, and I always forget Colton's total title, but he's one of the 2 people invited by the DOE to review projects, the other one coming from SMUD. But they're the technical guys that the DOE is pulling out of the industry to look at new technologies that the DOE is seeking to boost. We use NREL a lot together with stakeholders for our smart inverter research technology. We're still very heavily involved with the research labs, but there are other players now as well. EPRI, right, Electric Power Research Institute, doing a lot of stuff with us, alongside of us. Japan Inc. is very interested in things going on here. So there's partnerships there as well. Andy Karsner, part of HCEI, is very instrumental now with Elemental Accelerator. And so I'll be at a meeting with Elemental Accelerator Global Partners later next week where he will be there. So the players are still around. I'm not sure that the invitation is out there from the state to say, let's do something.
Okay, well, I just want to say to close, this is not only an honor for me as somebody who's starting out, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot from you all, and I learned a lot from everybody here too. And I'm really excited to continue this discussion and to continue everything. And I want to thank you all for joining me and for answering these questions. So please give a big round of applause for the panel. Thank you very much.